Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Reiser in for Vladimir Duthier. We continue to follow breaking news. CBS News learning that Paul Whelan, an American who has been imprisoned in Russia for nearly 6 years, and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was just sentenced by Russia to 16 years in a maximum security prison, are both part of a prisoner swap. Gershkovich, the Journal, and the State Department have consistently said the charges were false. The United States says Whelan was also wrongfully detained. Right now, we're looking at a live shot here out of Ankara, Turkey. We're seeing planes there on the tarmac. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins me now. Nancy, they're believed to be on board those planes, but we have to remind people that all this is taking place hush-hush, behind closed doors diplomacy. Remind us who Gershkovich, Whelan, and a third journalist are, and who else is part of this swap.
We understand it's a very complicated swap, so it's fascinating to see them see those planes on the ground in Ankara. But it's also possible that this could be taking place at multiple sites involving multiple prisoners. We just simply don't have all the details yet, Lindsay. As for the Americans who are involved, you're right. There are 3 of them. Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was taken into custody last year, accused of espionage, which the U.S. government has always denied. And then there's Paul Whelan. He is a former U.S. Marine. He was taken into custody nearly 6 years ago, also accused of espionage, also sentenced to 16 years. He has been in Russian penal colonies ever since. And then the third American you mentioned is Alsu Kurbasheva. She is a Russian-American radio reporter who was also taken into custody last year. So our understanding is that all 3 of them will be coming home. We don't have the details we can share yet about any Russians who might be headed back to Russia in exchange, either from U.S. prisons or from other prisons around the world. I can tell you that it caught the eye of reporters yesterday when we started to notice that some Russian detainees were being removed from U.S. prisons. Their names were disappearing from the system. And reportedly, the Americans were leaving their Russian prisons and penal colonies as well. And that was one of the first indications that something was going down after many months of on and off negotiations.
You say many months. Have we learned anything about how this was coordinated? You are oftentimes in the White House press briefing room. We know that members of the media have been asking questions, but we're talking about, for example, in Whelan's case, 5.5 years. And so certainly, while maybe this isn't top pressing news every single day in that briefing room, important to note that things do happen behind the scenes.
This has really been an agonizing wait for the Whelan family because they've watched several other prisoner swaps take place over the years that looked like they might involve Paul, and then he was left behind. Trevor Reed was released. He was actually taken into custody after Paul, and he was released first, partly because Reed was in bad health, and U.S. officials were very concerned about him and his condition. Then you had Brittany Griner, who was taken into custody years after Paul Whelan, the basketball star. She was sent back to the U.S. in a prisoner swap last year. For whatever reason, the Russians have resisted handing Whelan over. And so these talks have been taking place. We do ask about them periodically in the White House briefing. Obviously, U.S. officials are generally reluctant to give us any kind of update, anything that might influence the negotiations. Sometimes there's a message that they want to get across to the Russians publicly. I can remember one time several months ago when suddenly, I believe it was John Kirby said, "We haven't heard from the Russians for months. We've been trying to contact them, but they've gone radio silent." And that was an unusual detail we're not used to getting. And I was told later that, it was sort of a last-ditch attempt to get the Russians to re-engage because they simply weren't taking part in the negotiations.
Nancy, stand by for us. I want to bring in CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis. So, Olivia, what do we know about the process of getting these Americans home?
Well, Lindsay, I mean, this has been described to me as one of the most complex negotiations in the history of U.S. Russia and even U.S. Soviet relations, when we, of course, knew that spies were being routinely swapped between the two countries. But the reason that this case is different is the number of players involved and the type of prisoners involved. These are not just spies. These are what we know America has deemed political prisoners in the case of Evan and Paul and Alsu, all of whom we expect to step foot on American soil later tonight. As Nancy mentioned, speculation had been mounting as the names of some prominent Russian political dissidents had disappeared from the prison rosters where they were being held. Paul Whelan's whereabouts were suddenly not known. A prominent Kremlin critic, Vladimir Karamurza, suddenly disappeared. His lawyers didn't know where he was. So there was speculation growing in recent days that something was afoot. But as you have been discussing, there are a number of U.S. government agencies that are involved in these negotiations. The White House, the State Department, the CIA in previous negotiations has been the key channel through which the Russians prefer to deal with us. And as we await further details as to who was instrumental, we do know that some families are going to be very happily reunited in a matter of hours.
And when we talk about how complex this is, I mean, part of the reason is because of all the countries involved. What can you tell us about the prisoners Russia is getting in return? I know one of them shot a former separatist fighter in broad daylight outside of Berlin Park. He was in custody in Germany.
That's right. We know from public reporting that the Russians had their eye on Vadim Krasikov, who is, yes, as you mentioned, a convicted murderer who is serving a life sentence in Germany for the assassination of a German citizen who fought against the Russian forces in Chechnya. He has been there for years, and the Russians have had their eyes on him. But that meant that he was not in U.S. custody, right? He was not the Americans to trade. And so we're still waiting for details as to whether he is, in fact, part of this trade. There's been plenty of speculation that he is, because up until this point, the Russians, as Nancy mentioned, had been reluctant to engage in any deal that the U.S. had put on the table. And we do know from U.S. officials that, as they characterize them, significant deals had been put on the table in December and over the course of the spring.
Olivia, it has been nearly 2 weeks since Gershkovich was sentenced. Why is it believed that negotiations couldn't really begin in earnest until that happened?
That's more of the Russian process than it is the U.S. process. The Russians sort of need to do their bureaucratic paperwork. And usually as part of this, President Putin needs to officially pardon the people that he is letting out of his country. We're still seeing whether that entire process has played out. But yes, speculation, in fact, did start in early July when what was viewed as a very hurried process played out for Evan Gershkovich. People who follow this closely were saying that is a box that the Russians need to check before they let somebody go. And on the same day that his trial was running, in a secret trial, Alsu Kurmasheva was also being sentenced to 6.5 years in a Russian prison. So this was all very hurried in early July and may have been part of the groundwork that was being laid in these sensitive diplomatic and intelligence talks.
Olivia, stay with us as well. I want to bring in CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer. Liz, you've been in court with Paul Whelan in the past. What can you say about the gravity of this moment?
Well, Paul Whelan has been in custody longer than any of the other prisoners being released today. His family kept the case front and center. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow was exceptionally good in continuing to visit him. But we know that he has felt forgotten, and certainly during the COVID years, it was difficult to see him, and he would have felt very isolated. He was passed over several times. For example, when Greiner was released, everybody hoped that, or at least his family hoped that he would be released too, and it didn't happen. So today will be a huge relief for all the people, especially his brother, who've been advocating for this all this time.
You know, we had mentioned Vadim Krasikov, one of the imprisoned Russians imprisoned in Germany, that Putin was interested in getting back as part of this swap. Sort of reminds me of Victor Bout, the notorious arms dealer who was swapped for Greiner and that swap that happened. What does this tell you about why Putin and Russia want these dangerous loyalists back so badly?
Krasikov was an FSB agent, so he was an intelligence officer. And President Putin has to shore up the support of the intelligence community. That's his main constituent, like one of the pillars of his power base, and also the military. And so he makes a big deal out of getting back agents that have been taken into what he would consider enemy hands. And it's all part of the code of loyalty, showing that he is on the side of his security forces. And this will be a big part of that, and in fact will play very well in Russia, showing that the president always sticks up for his men.
Elizabeth Palmer, thank you so much. Let's bring back CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, do we expect to hear from President Biden or see him today?
I anticipate we will hear from him, Lindsay, as soon as it is confirmed that the entire prisoner swap has taken place successfully and that the Americans are safely on their way back to U.S. soil. Prior to that, the president, other U.S. officials are generally very reluctant to say anything. They don't want to do anything to anger the Russians, to jeopardize these very sensitive negotiations. So they tend to stay mum. We're not getting, any public reaction so far at all from U.S. officials for the most part, aside from confirming that this is imminent. But absolutely, as someone who has made the return of U.S. political prisoners around the world a major priority, I anticipate that President Biden will have something to say in public later today. And I'm sure he'll also want to see these Americans once they are safely back on U.S. soil and in good health, because he has met periodically with their families over the years, and he has talked about how badly he wants to bring them home. So this is no doubt a great day for him if everything goes as planned.
Nancy Cordes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For more on this, let's bring in William Pomerantz. He's the senior fellow and former director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. First, sir, thanks for being with us. Give us your read on this.
Well, it is a piece of very good news for all of the families of the detained prisoners. So I was not expecting this deal to really be done, but it has happened, and it will be a great day when all the Americans come back to U.S. soil.
Why was this not something you were expecting? Why is this a surprise?
It was a surprise because I thought that Putin would want to kind of extend these negotiations as long as possible, so that he wants to be relevant. And this was one way, a very difficult way to be relevant as well. So I didn't think that he was going to make a deal, and I didn't think that he had a lot of pressure to make a deal. But clearly, as one of your other commentators mentioned, there are several people who were in the security services, and Putin wanted to get them out through any means. So I think this will be a positive development for Putin, although it doesn't mean that U.S.-Russian relations will be on a positive footing for a long time to come.
Do you think that Putin takes American politics into account when making these deals and making these, because while there might be some concerns, certainly the Biden administration is going to try and express to the American people that this is a win in their view?
I don't think, quite frankly, Putin understands American politics in the larger sense of the word. And so he has made so many mistakes over the last 2.5 years that I don't think he really has a clear understanding of the political situation in the United States. If he believes that somehow this helps him politically, I don't think it will. I think that the United States and its European allies have basically said that they want to hold Putin accountable for this terrible war in Ukraine. And I don't think a prisoner swap changes that position.
Of course, we've been talking about Krasnikov. I mentioned Viktor Bout. These are some of the people that Putin wanted to get out of prison and back home to show that he is loyal to them, that they're loyal to him. Are there concerns about the concessions that the U.S. had to make in these cases?
There always are concerns. And the major concern is that once these prisoners are released, that Putin will just continue to find Americans or find Americans who are on Russian soil and will do the same thing. So there is the fear that this only engages Putin, and he will do this again because he gets a deal. So that is a real concern going forward.
All right, William Pomerantz, thank you so much. Appreciate your time and your expertise. Let's go back to Olivia Gazis. Olivia, any developments since we last spoke to you just a few minutes ago? I know this is a rapidly evolving situation.
Sure. I think we are still waiting for all of the Americans to be wheels up from that tarmac in Ankara. And when they do, we will hear more details about how this all came to pass. But as you were just discussing there, I do think it's worth noting that the U.S. government knows there is a cost to making these trades, right? They have a justice system that has put resources towards convicting these criminals who have committed crimes and are detained in American detention systems. That is part of the reason why the State Department in particular likes to remind Americans not to give the Russians fodder, as it will. They have Russia at a level 4 travel advisory, meaning do not travel to that country. It is an adversarial country. When you are there, you are at risk of being arbitrarily detained, and it is not clear that the U.S. government can do anything to help you. As we have seen in the cases of Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich, they had to go through a special process within the State Department in which they were determined wrongfully detained, because it can be the case that an American citizen goes and does actually commit an infraction or break a law and are legitimately imprisoned by a foreign government. In their case, the U.S. government went through its process and determined in neither case were they actually committing any of the crimes that they were accused of. And of course, the Russians in both of their cases accused them of espionage. In Alsu Kurmasheva's case, her case was still going through that deliberative process. She had not officially been determined to have been wrongfully detained, but President Biden personally called for her by name to be released in April at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which shed additional light on her case, and from its trappings looked as though she, like Evan Gershkovich, was a journalist on Russian soil.
And of course, on the flip side of those concerns, we have the families of Gershkovich and Whelan. I know we've heard from Gershkovich's parents. We've heard from Whelan's brother, who have both been making this plea for them to return home. And I know that they've been in communication with U.S. officials, right, Olivia?
Absolutely. The families here are the ones where your heart really goes out the most. And especially in the case of somebody like Paul Whelan, who, as you've been discussing, did get passed over effectively into additional negotiations that resulted in the release of Trevor Reed before him and Brittany Griner before him. So he's been the longest held American in Russian detention, and his family has been doing its best to keep his case in the media. His brother reaches out to journalists all of the time to provide an update on his case, to say Paul has written us to say he was beaten today or he got an orange today, to provide details that humanize the experience that he is having in a very severe Russian penal colony. His sister Elizabeth has been very active, engaging U.S. government officials traveling to Washington, D.C. to get in people's faces and make an effort to actually effort change in his case. In the same way, the Wall Street Journal obviously has unspooled a great campaign in order to keep Evan's case in the news. Hashtag slogan, journalism is not a crime. They know that the more attention these cases get, the more likely it is that pressure mounts on a given administration to actually fight for these people's release.
All right, Olivia Gazis, thank you so much. We are continuing to follow the latest on this major prisoner swap between Russia and the U.S., and our coverage continues right after this break. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Welcome back. We continue to follow breaking news. CBS News is learning that Paul Whelan, an American who has been imprisoned in Russia for nearly 6 years, and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was just sentenced by Russia to 16 years in a maximum security prison, are both part of a prisoner swap. Gershkovich, the Journal, and the State Department have consistently said the charges are false. The United States says Whelan was also wrongfully detained. For more on this, I'm joined by John Sullivan. He was U.S. Ambassador to Russia from 2020 to 2022 and is now a CBS News contributor. Ambassador, thanks for being with us. What is your reaction?
Well, first, I'm delighted for the Americans who've been released and their families. I was in my office at the State Department almost 6 years ago when Paul was set up by the FSB and arrested. I've been thinking about Paul, working on his case, talking to his family for a long time, and I know that his brothers, his sister, his parents are going to be overjoyed. Evan was arrested after I had left Moscow as ambassador, but I know that his family will feel the same way. And the other American who has been released, Aslu, her family will be overjoyed. I've spoken to all of them since I've left Moscow. So I have a feeling of elation for those Americans who've been released and their families, but I also know that there's a price that the United States and some of our allies, apparently Germany, have paid in releasing Russian dangerous criminals to get innocent Americans back home.
You know, you were mentioning Paul Whelan, and we heard from him last December, his 5th Christmas behind bars, and he was saying that he felt left behind because he was not included in the prisoner swap that included basketball star Brittany Griner. What do you know about why he wasn't included in previous prisoner swaps?
Well, from my conversations with the Russians, and I was engaged in a lot of negotiations with the Russians over Paul, some of it was about his release. Other negotiations were just about how badly he was being treated and to have that stop. But what the Russians would point to was the fact that they would characterize him as an American spy. They would say he's been convicted of espionage, and we don't trade spies for just any ordinary criminal. We want a like-for-like exchange. And they thought at that time that there wasn't someone in U.S. custody who would be an equivalent to be traded for Paul. We in the United States knew, of course, that was completely bogus, that Paul was set up. He's not an American spy. He doesn't work for U.S. intelligence agencies. But that was the Russian position.
What can you tell us about the Russian judicial system and how these trials went?
So I was an observer of Trevor Reed's trial, who is an American who was wrongfully detained, who was released while I was ambassador in 2022. I was frequently in the courtroom during his court proceedings. I was not allowed into Paul's trial because it was a secret trial with secret evidence that some of which even Paul didn't get to see. So the way I'd characterize the Russian judicial system is, it's to borrow a Russian cultural reference, it's a Potemkin judicial system. It's fake. It's phony. The courtrooms are beautiful. The judges wear beautiful robes with a gold chain that cinches the robe at the top. But it is completely a non-adversarial system. It's merely a means for the Russian government to justify what it's doing to an American who's been charged, in Paul's case, with espionage. It's not what an American lawyer, which I am, would think of as a court.
Appreciate you, Ambassador. Thank you for being with us. Let's bring back CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer. Liz, it's important to note, as important as this prisoner swap is and significant, there are still many Americans who have not been released and are not part of this deal.
That's right. I've just counted them up. There are 7 Americans that remain in U.S. custody. And the distinction that the ambassador made there is crucial. So the majority of them are in jail for crimes, nothing to do with the security establishment, and as far as we can tell, not trumped-up charges either, although the details aren't clear in every case. But, for example, 2 of them were arrested on drugs charges, possession. One man is involved in a child custody dispute with a Russian wife. One has been arrested for theft and beating up his girlfriend, and one for being completely blind drunk on a train and attacking a policeman. The one exception is Ksenia Karolina from L.A. She was picked up in Russia this spring and has been charged with treason, which carries a sentence of 20 years, allegedly for having given money that reached Ukrainian military. It's not clear what's going to happen with her, but we do know for sure she wasn't included in this prisoner exchange, and that will have been devastating for her family.
Liz, we have been talking a little bit about Gershkovich and Whelan. There are two other people as part of this. There's also Kermashev. She's a U.S. dual nationalist. There's also Vladimir Kara-Murza. He's a prisoner held in Russia. What can you tell us about these two?
He is a very brave guy. He is a human rights activist and sometimes politician. He ran to be a parliamentarian in Russia. But he was a strong opposition of President Putin. He also worked for one of the leading exiled opposition figures, the former chess champion. I'm blanking. It'll come to me in a second. Anyway, Khodorkovsky. And so, as such, he really identified himself, made himself very prominent as an opponent of the Russian government. And he was arrested, charged with treason, and has been in jail ever since. Although he's a British citizen, Cambridge educated, he has really strong ties to the United States. He worked on human rights cases with the late Senator McCain, and Senator McCain emailed him shortly before his death and asked him if he would be one of the pallbearers at the senator's funeral. He also continued to write very critical political commentary from inside jail and won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for those writings. It will be inexpressibly wonderful for his family to know he's getting out, because he believes he was poisoned twice by the Russian security services. His health has been fragile, and he hasn't been getting the care in jail that he has needed. So now he'll be back in safe hands.
Liz, thank you so much for joining us again. Appreciate it. We have been covering this major breaking news. You're seeing on your screen right now a plane on a tarmac there in Turkey. There is a big prisoner swap underway currently, and exact movements and whereabouts of the prisoners that we have been mentioning aren't exactly clear to us right now. We're working to gather more information on that. But some names that you have been hearing, Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, they're part of the prisoner swap. As well as being swapped for a Putin ally who is jailed in Germany and convicted of murder there. For more reaction from Capitol Hill, let's go to congressional correspondent Scott McFarland. Scott, what are you hearing?
Well, there is this dual political message that's beginning to emanate as the morning concludes here in Washington, Lindsay. There are Republicans, including the House Republican chair, Elise Stefanik, criticizing the nature of any agreement that releases dangerous Russians as part of an agreement. And Michael McCaul, who is the top Republican on the Foreign Affairs panel here in the U.S. House, has also said, while grateful for the return of these heroic Americans, there is concern that there is an exchange that could incentivize future hostage taking. I expect to hear a lot more of that on the campaign trail as J.D. Vance and former President Trump make their arguments today, and among House and Senate Republicans as they make their arguments through the day here at the Capitol. As for the president's supporters in Congress, they are championing what they would say is not only the release of Americans who long ago should have been released, but by the stewardship of the administration to get this done now.
Do you expect that the concern and applause will be divided along party lines with this issue, Scott?
I sure do. I think this is one of those things that, though in a more fundamental dynamic, it transcends politics. Everybody is grateful for their safe return. This in no way is going to transcend politics when it comes to the machinations used to secure their release. This will be a campaign issue that is wielded, no doubt, by Republicans arguing too high a price had to be paid to get these hostages back. But take a look at the statement from Philadelphia Congressman Brendan Boyle there on the screen. Their unjust imprisonment as hostages is yet another sobering reminder of how evil the Putin regime really is. There is a synchronization, Lindsay, among both parties that the Putin regime is, in fact, evil. And there's another statement. Haley Stevens is a Democrat from suburban Detroit saying, "Your family have been tireless advocates, and we cannot wait to see you reunited." So you have that. You have Democrats championing the president for his stewardship. You'll have Republicans saying that these types of negotiations may trigger more hostage taking in the future. You can't suck out the politics from all of this, even though there, of course, is unanimity in the expressive relief that these hostages are coming back home.
You said unity in expressive relief. Have the families of Evan Gershkovich or Paul Whelan met with Congress? Have they spoken in front of Congress before?
Yeah, the supporters of these families and these families themselves have been actively vocalizing their hopes, their aspirations with Congress. And there are congressional panels that have gotten into this, had their own investigations, had their own hearings. But this is a unilateral move, really, to a degree, of the executive branch. This is the president and the president's team leading this effort. Congress can offer its opinions, can offer funding to help support protective efforts, but this really is the administration's world. Congress, though, is certainly going to give their opinions as the day continues.
Scott McFarland, thank you so much. And we continue to follow the latest on this prisoner swap between Russia and the U.S. Our coverage continues right on the other side of this break. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Welcome back, everybody. We continue to follow breaking news. CBS News learning that Paul Whelan, an American who had been in prison in Russia for nearly 6 years, and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was just sentenced by Russia to 16 years in a maximum security prison, are both part of a prisoner swap. Gershkovich, the Journal, and the State Department have consistently said the charges are false and he had a sham trial. The United States says Whelan has been wrongfully detained for nearly 6 years. CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis joins us now. Olivia, for anyone just joining us, give us some of the top lines of what we know right now.
Sure, Lindsay. Well, U.S. officials who have been intimately involved in this months-long negotiation process have described it to me as the most complex in U.S. Russian history and even U.S. Soviet history, which, as we know, the spy swaps at that time were legion. This one outdoes that one, any of those, because of how many players are involved and the types of prisoners that have been involved. These are not strictly spies that we're talking about. We are talking about political prisoners, and their cases are necessarily more fraught in negotiation. The Russians can be more capricious in who they hold for what reason, and that's one of the reasons why this case has officials expressing just how difficult it was to get over the finish line. Speculation had been mounting over the course of this week that some kind of a deal was afoot. Russian prisoners started disappearing off of their prison rosters. Prominent political dissidents, suddenly their whereabouts were unknown. Among them, among the prisoners whose names started disappearing were Paul Whelan and Vladimir Kara-Murza, a prominent Kremlin critic who we understand may be part of these negotiations as well. So we're waiting for the full details on what Russia is receiving in exchange. But what we do know is that 3 American citizens are set to set foot on American soil, hopefully in a matter of hours.
Olivia, do we know who in the administration and U.S. government has been taking the lead on these negotiations? And what have we reported in the past on negotiations and sort of the steps that led us here?
Sure. Well, we know that in the past this has involved a whole of government undertaking. So the White House, the State Department, and when it comes to the Russians, usually the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, are going to be involved. And that's what we understand to have been the case here. So that is multiple agencies handling multiple parts of this negotiation, the diplomacy of it, the deals that ultimately needed to be struck, the logistics of where these prisoners might actually wind up being physically escorted to their respective modes of transportation. We also needed to understand what the Russians would ultimately agree with in order to free the Americans they were holding. They had been resistant to any deals that had been put on the table in the past, and U.S. officials have made clear that they believe they were putting significant offers on the table that the Russians had repeatedly rebuffed.
Olivia Gazis, thank you. I want to bring back William Pomerantz. He's a senior fellow and former director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. What do we know about what will happen in the coming hours? If anything, this appears to be very secretive for good reason.
Well, we just have to make sure that all the people who are in this swap actually get on the plane and get sent to the United States and to their families. So it is a long process. For those of us who remember the Cold War, it was a very tricky process, and it always involved transitions and exchanges that took place mainly in East Germany. So I think that we're just waiting to see how the swap takes place, who is going to be involved in the swap, and what is the aftermath of the swap. I do not expect that it will be improved U.S.-Russian relations because of all the things that Vladimir Putin has done, both in the Ukraine and basically arresting and using these prisoners as hostages.
You have written extensively about the rule of law in Russia. What can you tell us about their judicial system and the trials for Gershkovich and Whelan, which the U.S. claim are sham trials?
Well, they are sham trials, and Russia has essentially a 99% conviction rate for criminal offenses. So it was inevitable that these people would be convicted. They aren't able to put up a defense. They are not able to see a lot of the evidence. So it was not a fair and open process. And that is a tendency that has long predated these cases, both in the Soviet Union and in the Russian Empire.
William, thank you. I want to bring back John Sullivan. He was U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2020 to 2022. He is now a CBS News contributor. Ambassador, do I have you?
Yes, you do. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us again. I want to ask you about the other countries that are involved in this, particularly Germany. We know that one dangerous prisoner that Putin wanted back was in jail, convicted of murder in Germany. What would Germany have to gain by agreeing to cooperate in this with the United States?
Well, yes, this is a big deal for the German government. When I was U.S. ambassador to Russia, I developed a very close relationship with the German ambassador, and we talked a lot about this case. This fellow, Krasakov, he's a colonel in the FSB, which is the principal successor to the KGB. He was sent by the Russian government to commit murder in a park in Berlin. He shot a Russian dissident to death on the orders of the Kremlin, and he's a colonel in the FSB. This was a state-ordered assassination on German territory. It greatly upset Chancellor Merkel and her government, and the KGB officer was given a life sentence. And now, for the Germans to release this individual, it's a very, very significant thing. My expectation is that there may be other Germans, for example. I understand there's a German who maybe have been detained in Belarus and actually given a death sentence, who may be released by the Belarusian government, which is just an indication of why this is such a complex deal. If it turns out to be what we're hearing through the grapevine, it would involve, for example, releasing detainees from potentially another country.
Will Krasakov return to Russia a hero? And maybe history can be our guide. Did Victor Bout, the notorious arms dealer who was released as part of the Brittany Griner swap, return to Russia as a hero?
I am confident in predicting he will not only return as a hero, he will be celebrated, at least in private, by President Putin himself. Putin is a Chekist, a KGB officer for decades. He's famously said there's no such thing as a former KGB man. This guy Krasakov is one of Putin's fellow Chekists. He will be welcomed back as a hero, including by the president of the Russian Federation, which just goes to show what the state of U.S.-Russia relations is. Putin believes, to his core, that Russia is at war with the United States and the West. And the way he would view these exchanges, these are like prisoner of war exchanges during wartime. This is not the case of there's a potential for U.S.-Russia relations to improve. As my friend Will Pomeranz said a little while ago, this is just a step in a very fraught relationship, and I don't expect U.S.-Russia relations to improve.
We're looking right now on the ground in Turkey at a shot that our camera has of a tarmac there. Possible that one of the prisoners are on board one of these planes. Of course, this is being done behind closed doors, out of view for a reason. This is sensitive. This is complex. And I want to ask you how significant it is that a country like Turkey is a part of this.
Well, it is significant and, again, increases the complexity of the deal. It was complex when we did a one-for-one trade back in the spring of 2022 when Trevor Reed was traded for Konstantin Yaroshenko, who was convicted in the United States of a major narcotics trafficking conspiracy. That trade occurred in Ankara, I expect at the same airport, maybe even in exactly the same location. The Turkish government was involved, and a one-for-one trade like that was a very complex undertaking. What we're witnessing today is far more complex, but we do have the muscle memory for doing this type of trade in Turkey, in Ankara, because that's where Trevor Reed was recovered by the United States.
Ambassador, thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
We are continuing to follow the latest on this prisoner swap between Russia and the U.S. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. We continue to follow breaking news. CBS News is learning that Paul Whelan, an American who has been imprisoned in Russia for nearly 6 years, and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was just sentenced by Russia to 16 years in a maximum security prison, are both part of a prison swap. Right now, you are looking at images of a tarmac in Turkey, one of the countries believed to be part of this as this rapidly unfolds, and we work to gather more information. CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis. So, Olivia, even though we heard from Scott McFarland, our congressional reporter, earlier in the show that some members of the Republican Party are trying to say maybe cast doubt on this swap because of at least one dangerous criminal. We know there are several people part of this swap, but there are concerns that he's being released as part of this. But we just heard the White House reporter for the BBC talking about how historic and monumental this is for the White House.
That's right, Lindsay. I think that political attacks on this deal are going to be inevitable because the deal inherently involves a cost, right? At the end of the day, a criminal that the U.S. or another country took time to arrest, to prosecute, to convict, is going free in exchange for U.S. citizens who committed no crime. So there is a cost to doing that. There's a cost to dealing with the Russians always. U.S. officials who deal in this always make that calculus. They have to say, not only is it a worthwhile exchange, but can this person, once we release him, pose a threat to the United States, go back to a criminal lifestyle, or another way, undermine the national security of the U.S. or other Western governments. That's a calculus that they make, and in deal making, sometimes you have to make tough decisions. We do know that this has been a priority for President Biden, that it involved a multi-agency effort, the State Department, the CIA, the White House, and that it was one of the most complex deals, as U.S. officials who have been involved in these negotiations have described it to me, in U.S. Russian and even U.S. Soviet history. We know that speculation has been mounting. There's a lot of unconfirmed reporting about who is involved in the swap. We hope to learn those details as soon as the American citizens who are going to be on their way back to the United States are wheels up from that tarmac in Ankara.
Is it significant that this is unfolding at a time that Secretary of State is wrapping up a trip overseas in Asia?
I don't think that you can decide when deal breakthroughs get done. I mean, the Secretary of State also has lots of competing priorities, right? So he has spent most of this week overseas shoring up alliances with Indo-Pacific partners. And no doubt he has a cadre of senior officials who have been handling this in his absence. But it's also known that the Russians have rebuffed diplomatic efforts to handle this and instead preferred that this occur in intelligence channels, meaning the CIA.
Okay, Olivia Gazis, thank you so much for your expertise on this. We will continue to have a lot more coverage throughout the day on this breaking news story. This monumental swap, prisoner swap between the United States and Russia involving Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan, who has been in Russian custody in a Russian prison penal colonies for nearly 6 years. We're going to stay on top of this. CBS Mornings is next. This is CBS News 24/7.